Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
When your parents look you directly in the eye and tell you they cannot afford 2 tickets for a family vacation, and then you watch them slide an envelope across the table to your brother with a cruise pass inside, you suddenly see the entire map of your family dynamics drawn in neon lights, a map you had pretended not to read for years. I sat there, stunned, with a fork suspended halfway to my mouth, while Mark grinned like a child on Christmas morning, already picturing himself sipping cocktails somewhere on the deck of a Mediterranean ship. My parents clapped him on the back, laughed about how much he deserved the break, and explained in a casual tone that cruises were expensive, and that maybe next time they would try to include me, as though I were some distant relative or a half-acquaintance instead of their daughter who had lived under the same roof for nearly 3 decades. It was not the first time the scales tipped his way, of course, but something about this particular moment, the sheer boldness of handing him a golden ticket while feeding me the line about limited finances, snapped something inside me. I thought of every electricity bill I had covered when my dad's hours were cut back, every grocery haul I had paid for without demanding repayment, every time I quietly replaced broken things in the house without announcing it because it felt easier than arguing. I thought of the flat-screen TV in the living room that I had chosen and paid for when my mother's old one gave out, and of the laptop my father used daily that I had bought on a Black Friday sale, presenting it as a family gift. I thought of the endless piles of laundry I had done and the countless dinners I had cooked while Mark simply lived his bachelor life, breezing in and out of the house with the confidence of someone who knew he would never be questioned or criticized. I forced myself to swallow a bite of food that tasted like dust, and I tried to keep my face neutral, because my family had a gift for twisting emotions back onto me, making me look ungrateful or dramatic whenever I dared to voice a complaint. I smiled tightly and said, "That's nice for him." My mother beamed, nodding as though I had blessed their decision. My father went into a detailed explanation of the ship's itinerary, the historical ports, the luxury dining, his voice swelling with pride, as though he were the one embarking on the adventure. Meanwhile, I was shrinking inside, compressing anger and humiliation into a dense, unyielding knot in my chest. That night, I scrolled through my brother's social media posts from the past, a string of vacations, parties, and indulgences funded by who knows what combination of my parents' support and his own smug entitlement. Every photo was another reminder of my role as the workhorse, the reliable background character, the one who could be counted on to clean up, cover costs, and accept being overlooked. But as I sat in my room, the walls pressing closer with every second, I realized something had changed. This was no longer about disappointment, it was about clarity. They had revealed the truth with perfect simplicity. I was not their priority, and I never had been. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine a world where I no longer played the part they had written for me. I pictured the house without my contributions, the rooms stripped bare of everything I had provided, the silence ringing louder than any argument. A small, almost dangerous smile crept onto my face at the thought, because the image wasn't one of loss, it was one of balance, finally restored. I could hear my mother's voice in my head, scolding me for being too sensitive or making a scene, but in this vision, I wasn't making a scene at all. I was simply removing myself and everything I had poured into their lives, leaving them with nothing but the echoes of their choices. As the days passed and Mark prepared for his big adventure, I played along, feigning mild interest when he bragged about excursions and onboard spas. My parents fussed over his luggage, offering advice on sunscreen and currency exchange, while barely acknowledging that I would be alone at home holding everything together. But my silence was not the silence of defeat, it was the silence of planning. Each time I glanced around the house, I cataloged items in my mind, attaching them to memories of sacrifice. The leather sofa? Bought with my bonus check. The blender in the kitchen? A gift from me after my mother's old one broke. The car insurance paid up for months? My money. The list grew longer each day, and with every reminder, the knot in my chest loosened just a little, replaced by a sharper focus. The morning they left for the airport, my mother hugged me lightly, as though she were greeting a coworker, and my father reminded me to keep an eye on the mail. Mark smirked and told me he would bring back something nice. I watched them pile into the cab, luggage stacked like trophies, and as the car disappeared down the street, the house fell quiet, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. For the first time in years, I felt no urge to cry, no ache of longing for their approval. Instead, I felt a calmness that scared me more than anger ever could. I stood in the middle of the living room, surveying the space, and whispered to myself, "Let's see how they like it when everything they've taken for granted walks out the door with me." And in that whisper, I sealed my decision. There would be no going back. By the second morning of their sun-soaked absence, I had already discovered that clarity, when it finally arrives, does not explode like fireworks, but rather moves through a house like a tide, touching everything it ever paid for and leaving a wet line of ownership you can follow with one steady gaze. So I walked from room to room with a mug of coffee that went cold in my hand while I mentally tallied each object I had carried across doorways and upstairs. Each bill I had quietly linked to my card, each service I had set up in my own name because someone had to, and I realized that my life in this house had been a generous subsidy disguised as family love. I opened the cabinet and found the dishes I bought when my mother wanted to host a proper Thanksgiving after her chipped set embarrassed her in front of the neighbors. I ran my fingers across the dining table I had assembled alone while my father claimed his back hurt and Mark texted from a bar about a game he could not miss. I checked the serial numbers on the television and soundbar because I had learned to keep receipts after arguments mysteriously erased history, and I pulled out the folder where those receipts slept like insurance against gaslighting. A paper chorus that could testify on my behalf if anyone ever questioned what belonged to whom. I moved to the kitchen and stared at the blender, the air fryer, the espresso machine that had been treated like a communal fountain. And I saw not appliances, but a timeline of the last few years in which I had used holiday bonuses and overtime pay to keep this place humming, so I took photos. I uploaded invoices to a single folder, and I calmly labeled each item with a sticky note that only I would understand, a tiny private code that told me what came with me and what could stay to prove the point I had been silently carrying since childhood. The point, as it formed itself into a plan I could actually execute, was not destruction or chaos or some theatrical tantrum that could be dismissed later as an overreaction. The point was reclamation, a simple act dressed in logistics. The kind of practical, tedious work no one thanks you for until it is missing, which, funnily enough, was the exact shape of my role in this family. Before lunch, I opened my laptop and began with the easy wins, those invisible wires that run a modern home and that nobody sees until they go dark, and with one deliberate breath I signed into my internet account. The one I had set up 2 summers ago when the signal kept dropping and everyone yelled at me as though I controlled the clouds, and I scheduled a cancellation for the day before they were due to return, which felt neat and poetic and just inconvenient enough to be instructive without being cruel. I pulled up the streaming platforms and removed the living room television from my devices list. I paused automatic payments on the cloud storage my father used for his photos, but never backed up properly. And I changed the passwords to the accounts attached to my own email because I had been taught by experience that boundaries must be made of passwords, invoices, and very clear ownership, not soft promises and family nostalgia. In a separate browser tab, I opened my renters' insurance and updated the list of covered items to reflect that these objects would soon be relocated. It was the kind of meticulous adult work that had always fallen to me. And doing it now did not feel like drudgery, but like writing my name on the bottom of everything I had carried for them. After lunch, I called Mia and Jonah, the 2 friends who had listened to me for years without rolling their eyes, and I told them I might need a few strong backs and a borrowed dolly, and instead of asking whether I had lost my mind, they asked for a date and a time. Their voices measured and practical, which gave me the steadiness I needed to keep moving without spiraling into old guilt. Then I called a moving company with weekday availability and a reputation for discretion, and I scheduled a pickup for the morning 2 days from now, which would leave me 1 day for sorting and 1 day for a last sweep. And while I was on hold listening to instrumental versions of songs about love, I added a second pickup from a small women's shelter across town for the items that were mine to give, but I did not want to carry into my next chapter, because revenge, if it is going to taste like something you can live with, should leave behind a little good in the world rather than only scars. In the late afternoon, I pulled down the family photo boxes that had been stacked on a high shelf beside a stack of board games we never played, and I sorted quickly, not because I wanted to erase the past, but because I wanted to keep only what was real. So I set aside the picture where my mother looked genuinely proud of me at my community college graduation before she pivoted the conversation to Mark's promising internship, and I kept the snapshot of my father laughing while I changed attire in the rain because we both knew I was better at it, and I put into a neat pile the glossy cruise brochures that had been mailed for months to our address with my name on the customer line, a branding oversight that now felt like a dare. I slid those brochures into an envelope with a small handwritten note to myself that read, in tidy letters, "Not for them," and I tucked it into my tote, a quiet private ceremony that felt more binding than any speech I could have delivered at the kitchen table. Evening crept in and shadows stretched across the living room rug I had chosen after a week of comparing prices, and with the house dim and almost tender, I made one last circuit, tagging the router, the modem, the surge protectors, the lamps, the bookshelf. The framed art prints I bought at a street fair where my mother said the colors were a little loud, but then accepted them into the living room because they warmed up the space, and as I moved I could feel my old obedience stroking at my ankles like a persistent cat, purring a familiar song about being reasonable and patient and grateful for what you have, yet I kept walking because reason had been my leash for too long and patience had always been demanded of only one child. I wrapped the espresso machine with care as if I were packing up a small animal. I emptied the silverware drawer into a padded bin. I folded the throw blankets I had purchased during a winter cold snap, and I set everything by the front door in neat rows, which looked less like a heist and more like a well-organized departure, the kind of thing that would mess with the narrative should anyone later try to paint me as reckless. When I finally sat down, the couch I had bought sighed under me like an accomplice, and I opened my messages to scroll through Mark's latest cruise photos, where he grinned with a drink the color of candy and a caption about living his best life, and I typed a simple heart. Not because I felt one, but because it would keep him from sensing the earthquake forming under his feet, and then I turned the phone face down and let the quiet house tell me what to do next. I ordered a small storage unit after comparing prices for half an hour because revenge can be principled and still budget-conscious. I printed labels with my name in large clear letters, and I set an alarm for an early start. A ritual that felt surprisingly peaceful. When I finally killed the lights and stood in the doorway of my room, the hallway breathing that cool hollow air of a place waiting for change, I rested my hand on the doorframe and decided to add one more small measure to the ledger. Not cruel, not illegal, only instructive. I scheduled the thermostat's programming to vacation mode beginning the night before their return, which would let the house sit a little too warm and a little too still, a silent prelude to the shock that waited for them. And I whispered into the dimness that tomorrow the house would begin to remember who actually kept it alive. And as I lay down, more exhausted than anxious, my mind drew the final contour of the plan with one satisfying stroke, because the moving crew would arrive after dawn, the storage unit would be ready, the shelter van would take what I was ready to gift. The services would quietly wink off at the appointed hour, and the only thing left to decide was what message to leave behind that would make the lesson unmistakable without closing every door for the rest of my life, which is why I fell asleep, wondering not whether I should leave a note, but which sentence would make them finally hear me, and I knew, with a certainty that did not feel cruel at all, that in the morning I would choose the words that would land like a key turning in a long-ignored lock. Dawn arrived with that gray, undecided light that makes a house look like it is holding its breath, and I took the hint. Tying my hair back with the same focus I used for job interviews while the kettle clicked and the moving truck's arrival window blinked on my phone like a dare, so I walked the main floor one last time, running my fingers along objects that had become so ordinary they were almost invisible, then reminding myself that invisibility had been the entire problem, which meant I Needed to make this morning visible in a way no one could rewrite later. The crew texted that they were 10 minutes out, and right on their heels came Mia and Jonah, both carrying travel mugs and the sort of determined faces that make you realize friends are the only family you actually get to choose. And when Mia made a joke about us staging a museum deinstall, I laughed harder than I expected, because if there is a humor flavor for relief, it tastes a bit like a first breath after a long swim. We started with the heavy pieces because momentum matters, and the leather sofa slid onto the dolly like it had accepted a verdict, while I taped the manifest to the top cushion, a neat list of model numbers, purchase dates, and my initials. The bureaucratic poetry you need when memory refuses to serve justice. The bookshelves were next, the coffee table wrapped like a cello, the rug rolled and taped with an arrow that said my new place this side up, every label a small rebuke to the years I was told to stop keeping score. What surprised me was how peaceful the pace felt, a rhythm of lift, secure, roll, and stack, punctuated by the chirp of moving straps and the occasional grunt from Jonah, who announced that he was developing respect for my former taste in solid wood furniture, and I teased back that I always buy things for the long haul, which made Mia raise an eyebrow that said about more than furniture. When the lead mover asked for clarification about the television and the soundbar, I handed him the receipt folder like a judge sliding a case across the bench, and he whistled at how perfectly everything matched. Not in a flirtatious way, but in the respectful tone of someone who appreciates an airtight plan. I let that sound settle into the room because for once admiration flowed toward the person who had done the work rather than the person who had simply shown up to enjoy the results. We loaded the espresso machine with almost maternal care, and when Mia laughed that revenge powered by caffeine could probably light a small town, I told her I preferred the term recalibration because it sounded like what it was, a correction, not a catastrophe. By late morning, the main rooms had shifted from familiar to echoing, a transformation that would have felt like a gut punch if not for the sight of my name in bold marker on every box, a chorus I had craved without knowing it. And while the movers took a water break, I floated through the kitchen, sweeping the drawers into padded bins, the knives wrapped in dish towels, the measuring cups nesting like small forgiving moons. I hesitated at the family drawer, the one with rubber bands, a half-dead torch, batteries that rolled like marbles, and a stack of restaurant menus that had grown soft at the edges from hurried fingers, and instead of tossing I sorted. A quiet act of respect for utilities that had held us together when the people could not. I left behind the screwdriver set and the tape measure, because I wanted them to know exactly how much I could have taken and consciously chose not to, and that kind of boundary is sweeter than any sting. The shelter van pulled up right as the movers closed the truck door on the first load, a modest vehicle with careful lettering and a volunteer who introduced herself as Carla and thanked me in a voice that carried the weight of 100 stories heavier than mine. I gave her the extra bed frame, the spare microwave, the set of pots that had spent too many evenings feeding people who did not say thank you, and I watched those items climb into a future where they would actually be appreciated, which was a kind of private bomb no one can begrudge. Afternoon heat pressed into the hallway, and I used it as an excuse to step into my room for a final sweep, passing the mirror where I had practiced patient smiles for years, and I took down the last 2 art prints, wrapped them in an old sweater, then opened the small fireproof box that held documents and the thin pile of photographs I had decided to keep, and I added to it one glossy cruise brochure addressed to me, a lightning bolt of branding that I tucked in as evidence for no one but myself. When I emerged, Jonah had dismantled the dining table with the competence of a person who respects instructions, and Mia was labeling the last box of dishes with a frankness that made me grin. Ours now, do not return. I signed the mover's manifest, scheduled the storage unit access code to ping my phone, tipped the crew with a gratefulness that felt bigger than cash, and then I stood in the center of the hollow living room, listening to the hum that remained when a house loses its objects, a strange, almost embarrassed sound, as if the walls finally realized what had been holding them up. Before we left, I sat at the kitchen counter with a pen and a crisp sheet of paper and wrote the first draft of a message I had been tracing in my head for days, careful not to let fury steer the sentence, and when I finished, I folded the note but did not leave it because the timing of a message is part of its meaning, and the right words delivered too early become a tantrum rather than a truth. Instead, I slid an envelope under the empty fruit bowl we never filled, addressed simply to the household in my neat block letters. And inside, I placed photocopies of a handful of invoices and a short line that said, "We will talk when you can speak to me as a person," followed by a date that did not match their return but came 2 days after. A courteous delay that would give them time to feel the vacuum and decide how to fill it. Then, with a grip that did not tremble, I reached into the hall closet and pulled down the stack of framed family portraits, the staged grins from school graduations, and a couple of holidays where the joy looked forced even then, and I lined them carefully on the now empty mantel, each frame turned backward so the hinges faced the room, a tiny stage set for the conversation they had dodged for years. I took one photo with my phone, for memory not malice, then placed a single sticky note on the glass of the biggest frame with a sentence that made even me inhale, "Open when you are ready to see what I see." We locked the door behind us, and as I slid the key through the mail slot, my key, earned and replaced more times than I can count, I felt the quiet satisfaction of an ending that answered to no one's script but mine. Yet even in that satisfaction, a new question lifted its head like a stubborn weed, because there was still Mark, the accidental prince of this shabby kingdom, and something small, deliberate, and not at all gentle would need to arrive for him alone. Which is why I set the small box, labeled for Mark, on the porch before we drove away, a box that held one folded brochure, a photocopy of a receipt with my name on it, and a single, gleaming key that was not for our front door but for a place he would not expect. And as the car rolled toward the storage unit, I let the idea bloom into certainty that by the time he figured out what that key unlocked, the balance he kept mocking would finally snap into place with a click they would all hear. They returned at dusk with the kind of careless laughter people carry home from airports, the rolling suitcases thunking on the front steps like an announcement of triumph, and I stood across the street in my parked car with the engine off and the window cracked, letting the humid evening drift in while I watched them unlock a door that would open onto air where furniture used to be, because revenge, when it is actually a correction, works best in silence, and I wanted the house to speak first. The moment the door swung inward, my mother's voice rose into a shriek that had less grief than disbelief in it, a high note that snapped off as quickly as an overstretched thread. While my father said my name in that stern way he had used when I was a child and a glass broke on the tile, and then Mark, suntanned and loose from days of bottomless drinks and easy applause, shouted a baffled string of accusations that melted into a single stunned question about the Wi-Fi, which, given the dark modem lights and the suddenly dumb television, answered itself without my help. I watched the thermostat's programmed stillness do its quiet work as heat settled into the rooms, softening the smugness that clung to their vacation clothes. And I pictured the turned-around family portraits on the empty mantel staring their blank backs into the room like witnesses who had finally refused to cooperate. I did not wait long before I called, because timing matters and I wanted their surprise to meet my calm rather than curdle into rehearsal, so when my mother answered with a rush of breath and a demand to know what I had done, I told her in an even voice that I had retrieved what belonged to me, that services in my name would remain paused until they set up their own accounts, and that a folder beneath the fruit bowl would explain the rest, which is when she broke into that familiar litany about how families do not keep score and how cruel it was to humiliate them after such a lovely trip, and I let her finish before I said, in a tone I barely recognized as mine, that families who do not keep score tend to ask for volunteers to carry the entire team, and that I was done volunteering. My father took the phone and tried authority, the old scaffolding he had relied on whenever fairness threatened to disturb his peace, and he said words like theft and overreaction and you have no right. Then paused when I told him the serial numbers, the receipts, the banking logs, and the email confirmations had all been photographed and backed up, that a copy of the most relevant ones sat inside the envelope, and that I would be happy to discuss civilly the difference between gifts and necessities I purchased for a home where I had been asked to function as the invisible sponsor. When he sputtered, I suggested, as kindly as a person can in that moment, that he sit down on one of their Remaining chairs, because this conversation had waited a very long time. Mark texted while I was still on the call, a barrage of shocked disbelief punctuated by a photo of the empty living room and an accusation that I had ruined everything for a petty tantrum, redeemed by a single startled line at the bottom asking what the small key in the porch box was for, and I did not answer immediately because impatience had long been his favorite rope for pulling favors. Instead, I ended the call with my parents by telling them I had penciled in a time 2 days from now at 10 in the morning, a location included in the envelope, and that if they preferred to scream rather than speak, they could make other arrangements with a lawyer who would be less patient than I am. My phone vibrated again with Mark's text turning from swagger to curiosity to an edge of something like fear, and I finally replied with a single sentence that would force him to sit inside his own head for a while. "You will know when you arrive. Bring only your mouth and your memory," which was both instruction and mercy, because I wanted him unarmed by rehearsed defense and very aware of the story he had been telling himself since childhood. Inside the house, they began opening cabinets and closets, and I pictured their hands meeting absence the way a swimmer's hands meet air when they expected water, the reflexive shock making them gulp. And I allowed myself one mean little smile when the kitchen revealed its neat vacuum where the espresso machine and blender had stood, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I wanted them to understand the texture of my contribution, a texture that had been tasteless to them until it disappeared from their tongues. The streaming apps blinked out on the television, the router's face remained dark as a closed eyelid, the thermostat slid into its pre-programmed lethargy, and in that careful quiet their outrage turned into a flurry of rummaging until someone, probably my mother, found the envelope and tore it open, the photocopied invoices unfolding like witness statements, the brief letter addressing them not as parents, but as grown adults who had made choices, and beneath the papers a short printed line accepting an invitation to meet at a neutral location that carried my name on the lease, which would be an education in itself, because they had never walked into a space that was mine alone. I drove away before they could spill into the street to scan the neighborhood for me, and as the car slid into the slow traffic of a city shrugging off daylight, I felt the familiar drag of guilt try to climb into the passenger seat, listing all the reasons this was too harsh, too dramatic, too final, and I answered it aloud that too harsh had been asking me to fund a household while pretending I should be grateful for a leftover cruise keychain, that too dramatic had been the performance of pretending I was equal at the same table where the best meal was always plated for someone else, and that too final had been their years of decisions long before I gathered mine across the threshold into boxes with my name written in permanent ink. I parked a few blocks from the location printed in their envelope, a small office at a co-working space with cheap coffee and clean lines and a glass door that would frame their faces when they arrived, and I let myself into the room I had rented under my own account, placing 2 chairs across from mine and setting a single object in the center of the table, the very thing their stories had always avoided, a simple ledger I had prepared with dates, amounts, and notes typed in a font they would recognize from birthday invitations and school permission slips, the handwriting of the person who had always done the arranging. The phone buzzed again, Mark, insistent this time, a demand to know if the key meant a car or a storage unit or some humiliating stunt, and I texted back the address that matched the key's tiny stamped number. A place he had never noticed though it sat 5 blocks from our house, and I added a final sentence that I hoped would change the angle of his spine as he read it. Open the door, sit down. And then ask yourself when you first learned that someone else would fix whatever you broke, because tomorrow that class ends. I turned off my phone, watched the empty chairs across from me, and felt my own pulse slow to something steady and unfamiliar, the pace of a person who has finally moved from the hallway of her life into a room with a door she can close. Which is where I was sitting the next morning when footsteps paused outside the glass and a shadow lifted a small key toward a lock that was about to admit more than one person bargained for. They came into the glass-walled room like people walking into a bank to dispute a charge, stiff-backed and louder than the silence required. And I let them take the 2 chairs I had set across from me while I kept my hands folded on the ledger that had already made my heart steadier than any apology could. And as my mother began with the trembling performance about family bonds, and my father cleared his throat to announce that this would be handled the proper way, the door opened again with a soft, slightly embarrassed scrape, and Mark slid into the room not with his usual bounce, but with that slow, uneven gait of a man who has just seen himself from a distance and did not like the angle. Because he had already used the little stamped key to open the Unit 5 blocks from the house and found, not a pile of his stuff or some cruel trick designed to humiliate him, but a gray metal chair, a full-length mirror leaned against the cinder block wall, a box labeled "Start here" in my neat block letters, and inside it a stack of photocopied messages he had sent me over the years when he needed a quick bailout or a ride or someone to smooth something over. Clipped to a timeline of dates showing every time a bill in the house switched to my card while another charge for a bar tab or a last-minute trip hit his, and under that a cruise brochure addressed in my name. And beneath that a single photo of him at 8 years old standing in a lopsided soccer uniform while I tied his shoelaces. Because Dad was late again, with a note across the back in the same careful hand that said none of this was your fault unless you keep choosing it. I gave them a moment because I wanted the air to be heavy enough to hold my words without them floating away like past promises. Then I opened the ledger and slid it toward the center of the table, explaining in a voice that surprised even me with its absence of tremor that what lay inside was not a bill and not a lawsuit and not a trap, but simply a record with columns for dates and amounts and brief notes about what was purchased and why, and that I would not be arguing about any of it. Because I no longer negotiate with memory, I just file it, which is when my father reached for outrage and found nothing to grip, and my mother reached for tears and found they slid right off the glass of the room. And Mark reached into his pocket and put the small key down between us like a confession he could finally afford. I told them that the furniture and equipment would remain with me because I had paid for them, and because I needed them to build a home of my own that was not a museum of my sacrifices, that the services in my name would not be reconnected because they would be starting their own accounts like adults, and that I had created 2 options written on the last page of the ledger with the plainness of recipe cards. The first was a conversation about boundaries in which we stopped pretending we shared a life and began scheduling visits like people who respect each other's time, and the second was a purchase agreement with fair prices if they truly could not live without certain items and wanted to buy them from me over a reasonable period, interest-free, not because I think they deserve charity, but because I deserve peace. There was a small, almost comic moment when my mother asked if I was really going to charge my family for a sofa she had napped on after church, and I told her with a gentler smile than I felt that I had already spent a decade charging myself for a family that never made room for me, and I was simply correcting the invoice, which is when Mark, who had been staring at the mirror of the conference room as though it might tell him something, said in a voice that did not belong to the prince I had known that he had opened the unit, sat in the chair, and read every page in the box, and that for the first time he could not make the old story fit without choking on it, and that he did not want the television or the blender or the rug. He wanted to know whether there was any path forward that did not end with me vanishing completely, and the simplicity of that question struck my chest with a force that almost undid the entire architecture of this day. I told him there could be a path if he took the class that ends with learning to pick up what you drop, a line that made him half laugh and half wince because he recognized the echo of my text. And I said he could start by calling the power company himself and then texting me a photo of the confirmation like a grown man who understands how light arrives. My father started to object again and then stopped, not because he had surrendered, but because the glass made his bluster look small, and my mother picked up the ledger, read a few entries, and put it down as if it had burned her fingers. And I realized in that small movement that revenge is only the first rung of the ladder, and that dignity is what gets you to the landing where you can sit and decide whether you want to keep climbing. I slid a single white envelope across the table with neat instructions for returning the house keys, and an address for the portraits they would find on the mantel. And I said that when they turned those frames around they would see exactly the years they had loved us in the way they knew how, and the years they had loved the story more. And that I had left a note under the biggest frame not to shame them, but to close the loop that had kept me running in circles. This was not your home made by magic, it was mine made by work, and now I am taking the work with me, which means you can finally see what you truly have. I stood, not because I expected them to leap after me or beg or swear a vow, but because I had reached the end of what a room could do. And I told them I would be at the address on the card at the time printed there next week with a set of mugs and an extra chair if they wanted to start again in a way that did not erase me, and if they preferred not to. They could keep the ledger as a souvenir of the last day I accepted less than equal in a house I held up, and either way I wished them comfort. And quiet nights without the television blaring on a login that was never theirs. Mark picked up the key with a care that looked new on him and said he would call the power company before noon. My mother whispered my name like she had misplaced it years ago and just found it under a cushion. My father folded the ledger closed with a neatness that was almost respect, and I walked out to the hallway where the air smelled like copier ink and pine cleaner and a life that belongs only to the person who carries it. Outside, I drove to a small apartment with light that slides across the floor in the late afternoon and a door that answers to a key I paid for myself. Carried the first box labeled kitchen into a room that still felt like a question. Set the espresso machine on the counter as if it were a little engine for a new city, and placed a folded copy of the ledger in the top drawer where the utensils clinked like soft applause, then turned my phone face down and listened to the silence that did not accuse or demand but simply existed, the way silence does when no one is waiting for you to serve, and in that silence I did not decide whether they would choose option 1 or option 2, because the truth was that whatever they chose would be theirs to carry. Well, I had already chosen mine, which is why I took the cruise brochure from my bag, tore off the name line with the address printed in my letters, and slipped the rest into the recycling, a small, almost petty act that made me laugh out loud, because sometimes the neatest revenge is leaving the ending open and the door unlocked on your side only. So they have to knock gently and ask to be let in like people who finally understand that tickets are not the same as love and that a home is not a prize you win by standing closest to the sun.